thanks for the interest in this topic. I was asked to speak on some of the challenges, so I think you'll hear a little bit about some of the programs in the water, and I was asked to speak some of the overview of what you might run into if you delve into a program like this. So that is how my presentation here is geared. Being that I'm first here, I figured I'd put the obligatory slide of, why are we even talking about shellfish in the realm of nitrogen? So shellfish are very active filter feeders, right? So they're in those estuary environments that we want to clean up. They're filtering the water, they're clearing the water of algae, and I use the term clearing as opposed to cleaning intentionally because, what they do is they filter the algae out of the water, and they're acquiring nutrients from that algae that has then come from the upland land sources that sort of transferred into the estuary. And then the harvest of those shellfish could sort of remove those nutrients incorporated in their body tissues from the water. So that's why we're here. That's why they're an accepted alternative strategy, accepted by DEP. As a method to utilize, and one to consider as a suite of things to clean up the estuaries that we are trying to clean up. So it is a growing and harvesting operation. So we just talked about how they incorporate these nutrients as they grow. So that requires a lot of nurturing and care to get them through a cycle. It's not unlike land farming. You're buying seed, clams or oysters, and you're nurturing them all the way through, and then over the course of that lifetime, they acquire the nutrients that you would then remove. So with any sort of farming or fishing, for that matter, operation, there are challenges. You talk to anybody in food production, there are a suite of challenges, and we'll talk about a few of those here. So one of the challenges that can come up is siting, and one of those is the social acceptability of the space. So there are a lot of other users of the water, and yes, you might recognize some of these pictures from some of the towns that are represented here. Floating gear in particular is very visible, and there are a number of reasons to use floating gear, especially for culture of oysters. They do tend to grow better, they survive better, but you see it at the surface. And given that there are other users of the water, it's not always seen well in every environment. So, that is certainly one of the first things you would consider, taking on a project like this, especially if it's going to be a large-scale project. And then in some areas, there are water quality challenges. You may not be allowed to grow the shellfish in that environment because the water quality is such bacteriologically that you couldn't harvest them from that water. So the state has sort of standards that they need to abide by, handed down from the FDA to make sure that we're harvesting shellfish from clean waters. And with those water quality concerns come habitat concerns too. If the bottom is super muddy, it's really hard to work the bottom or have gear that sits on the bottom. So it's another reason you might float gear over top of a bottom that's not in great shape. So some of the challenges brought up, storms, ice, freezing, overheating, oysters getting too hot. These are all potential causes of loss that you'll hear from farmers. Storms especially, depending on where your farm is, if you have an exposure to one direction of wind, nor'easters in the winter, hurricanes in the summer. Seed availability, so if you don't have the seed or the baby oysters or clams to grow, you don't have much to work with, right? So more and more as the industry has grown, the commercial industry, there's more and more competition for that seed, and there's not nearly as many hatcheries as there should be. So there's there's competition for that seed, I guess is what I'm saying. And it can be spotty at times, whether you can get it or not. There are diseases, there are predators that can kill the shellfish. I think we've come a long way with gear types and managing genetics for survival, but they still do occur, disease epidemics. So these are veterinary diseases of shellfish that affect the shellfish themselves. And then the other big thing is if you're going to grow shellfish at large scale, for remediation of water quality, you need adequate resources to do that. You need the gear to do it, and you need the people who can manage that gear to do it. And those are all big things to consider. So then the shellfish need to be harvested, right? So again, this gets back to that water quality classification. Are you allowed to harvest there? Is it only seasonally allowed? Sometimes areas will be closed in the summer but open in the winter. So that becomes a big deal. Harmful algal blooms, they're becoming more prevalent in recent years, and they can close areas to harvest because of potential toxins in the water. And then who is going to harvest them? It could be commercial, it could be the recreational fishery. The recreational harvesters tend to be more limited in scale in what they're going to harvest. They're harvesting for a meal for themselves, as opposed to a commercial harvester who's harvesting at scale to sort of make a living. So all considerations when you think about a program and the numbers required to grow to meet your water quality needs. So gonna talk a little bit about market challenges next, and this is something 10 years ago I think I didn't have a full grasp on some of the challenges with the shellfish market, and the fact that it's a little bit of a tenuous market at best, especially with oysters. Something we learned the hard way, I think, in the pandemic. But first off, I've talked to people a lot about using shellfish for nitrogen mitigation, and this often comes up in questions after. There seems to be this idea that if you're using shellfish to clean the water, and I think that's where it's coming from. Like in the press, it gets the term cleaning the water or pollution or contamination sometimes. And nitrogen isn't really contamination, really. It's a nutrient. It's just there in excess. And so I think somehow we need to sort of reframe the way that it's being portrayed out there, because this idea of pollution control is sending a misconception, and people will inevitably ask, they can't be eaten, right? So, because they're full of contaminants. And really that's not the case, especially if they're being harvested from waters that are classified for that harvest. And, the state tests and make sure that they are or should be open to harvest. So this mixed messaging, I haven't found a good way to message it. I'm open to ideas, but I think the idea of clearing the water as opposed to cleaning it might be a way to go. Not totally sure. That hasn't been vetted with a focus group or anything. And then when you talk about market, you just need to understand supply and demand. So Massachusetts, as you can see here, those blue lines are oyster harvest. You can see the big blip in 2020 when the pandemic happened. But you can see production has expanded pretty rapidly over the last couple of decades. And, quahogs have been pretty stable, but very much a second product as opposed to the oysters, which are probably about 95% of production. So this is commercial shellfish production. But we are not the only state that's sort of taking this on and expanding aquaculture. So this is just an example from Virginia. You could see a similar trajectory there with oyster production. This is Rhode Island. You can see that blue line there is their oyster production. And then this is New Brunswick, Canada. Just an example from Canada. Again, similar trajectory. It's rapidly expanding. So you can imagine as you have more and more animals or shellfish being put on the market, there's some supply and demand dynamics there. So we were hearing this before the pandemic even, so we did a quick survey in 2019 and asked growers about, are you having trouble selling your product? And, the idea was to help explore, maybe alternative markets to sort of get around the glut. The fall glut is what was being termed as the biggest problem. And yeah, sure enough, you could see this question 3 over here. 90% of the respondents said, yes, in the fall we have major problems moving product. And then within that, and let's remember that this is a half-shell product. This is not sort of like a commodity product. It's a niche product. It's a half-shell product that's served individually opened at raw bars. That is 95% of the Massachusetts market. So you can understand why that sort of supply and demand dynamic exists. But the other comment that was expressed in this survey was like, real concern about, hearing numbers in the press about 10 million oysters here, 10 million oysters there for cleanup of projects, cleanup of water bodies, I should say. And, it was a real concern with growers. And just to give you an example of, how the market can be a little bit volatile. So the blue lines are aquaculture, oyster production. The red is wild, and you'll see there that, especially on the left, that figure there, the aquaculture oyster market, it's more stable, but does vary. While the wild oyster value tends to jump around a lot. So there's volatility in the market, and a lot of that is supply and demand dynamics, depending on the time of year. So that's over the course of a year. So any sort of large-scale push of new product into the market, where the market's not necessarily ready for it, it can sort of cause a collapse in the market as it sort of races to the bottom. Who's most desperate to move the product and sell it at the lowest price to get it out. So it should be a consideration when you're looking at a potential program to put millions of shellfish out there. What is the end result of those shellfish? Where are they going? And, not undercutting existing markets should be a thought. And just to further sort of explore that, looked at inflation really quickly, because inflation can be an indicator of supply and demand, and obviously if prices go up rapidly, the demand is higher than the supply. So gallon of gas, you could see it jumped pretty quickly. Since 2004, it's up 75%. So 2004 to 2022, gallon of milk, closer to 30%. So dairy is another industry that survives on very thin margins. So not a surprise that inflation was low there. Cornflakes, however, took a pretty big jump in the last 18 years. But then you look at oysters, and you see only a 14% increase in overall, per piece value to the harvester. That's pretty significant to me. It means that, we're starting to see a situation where we need to work on that demand side, I think, as we see the increase in supply. And yeah, when you put it into an inflation calculator, the inflation rate should have been about 55% since 2004. So 50 cents back in 2004 should be 77 cents now, but it's only about 57, depending on the year. So one of the things we've been working on is, just looking at what are some alternative markets. If programs like this, or programs for nitrogen mitigation and production of shellfish, do need sort of outlets for these shellfish being produced. So one thing, during the pandemic, we did experiment with shucking oysters to remove the meats and then donate them to the food bank system. Had no idea how this was going to work, but NOAA gave us a bunch of money to look at it, thankfully. And to our surprise, the food banks loved it. So you shuck the oysters, it's an added expense, but then freeze them into pint-sized containers. Some recipes were developed to help sort of get people interested in it. And yeah, the food banks loved it. They liked the idea of having local proteins being given out to the local community, and it seemed to work pretty well. And then there's the idea that maybe there are some non-commercial species out there that could be utilized to not compete with commercial markets. So my push here for donating oysters to the food bank, the size doesn't matter. Like, you can grow huge ones and grow less of them, maybe, so that you get more oysters or less oysters out, but the same nitrogen value. You're potentially feeding people without competing with other markets. There are some challenges for a town to even donate oysters. There's not a legal pathway yet. I think that there is workarounds there. And then, they still have the shucking cost. Seaweeds is another area we're exploring, especially if they can be cultured in the winter in these estuaries where there is no other existing activity or limited activity in the wintertime. Rib mussels have been talked about. They don't have a large commercial market, but they're ecologically important in the marshes, so there might be a way to utilize them. And then being told I have no time, so removing nitrogen through shellfish does require a lot of shellfish to get it done. Ramping up shellfish production does require a harvest strategy. What's going to happen with them? Think about that as you develop the plan. I am optimistic we can find other markets if there's desire on the part of municipalities. We're happy to work with folks. And then, if these projects are going to be just like one-off as sewers are developed, maybe that's one thing. But if they are going to be long-term production, I think we really need to think about how they're being utilized in the end, how they're being harvested. And that is it. Do you have time for questions, or is there a question? Yeah. Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, you talked about the market price for the wild harvester and also for local agriculturists. Is this strictly a local market and a local determinant of the price, or are you including, for instance, like the Chesapeake where they told them? Is it more of a regional market and a national market?
So the data I showed are just the Massachusetts reported values paid to the harvester. So that's a Massachusetts dealer buying them from, the harvester. But yeah, they go all over the place. Massachusetts oysters go around the world, really. No, not really. Once they're sold to a dealer. Yeah.
Josh, your supply and demand
Yep.
chart before, you showed a small increase in the return to the farmer per oyster, but oyster production over that same time period has exploded.
Right.
So what would the cash flow be like for the industry?
So, well, there's more people involved in the harvest of shellfish.
There's more people involved, but at the same time, there seems like there is no relationship between supply and demand in terms of what you're getting for the product.
Certainly, production has become more efficient, and I think that is the only way people can make it. But you talk to any oyster farmer, your margins aren't great.
Yeah, no, I don't think they're great. I just think that this shows that there's a tremendous increase in supply and the price has barely responded. Right?
Barely responded, like it should have gone up more. If it's
Well, not if there's that many oysters out there. In other words, it seems like the demand has not been met yet. Once the demand is being, you know what I mean? There's so many oysters available that if there was a limited number of oysters, you might get a higher price per oyster.
all I know is I get complaints earlier and earlier in the summer every year about the fall glut starting earlier. So
Yeah.
something's going on there. Ron, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, hi, thanks. I was just wondering if you do a cost comparison of like you produce oysters, and you mentioned about the water quality management, nitrogen uptake. Is it, if you do a comparison, say, versus sewers versus other options, maybe a town would be interested in just growing them and putting them out somewhere in an oyster, a living oyster reef. And so the cost of it, there'd be no selling. There would just be no cost. It'd be the cost of production versus the cost of running a sewer system and building it, or an IA system or other things. And maybe that would be an interesting comparison to look at.
So you're talking about just moving them to a different water body as a restoration. So you still get the credit for removing them from one water body.
Right, and maybe you put them in another place, maybe in the sound somewhere, create a reef, do something with them. But don't impact the growers market.
Right.
So it'd be like a municipal thing.
Yep.
And it would just be put out for water quality improvement.
The complaints I've heard about that one is creating a harbor for disease. So as long as you're away from all the commercial production, older shellfish tend to accumulate disease more. And yeah, so there's always something to complain about, right? All right, there's a lot of questions. Do we have time for more? One more?
10 minutes.
In the back.
Is there any interest, do you think, the people who are already commercial growers taking on a project on behalf of a town that wants to mitigate nitrogen pollution? So then you're not adding, like a grower could
So yeah, I think Falmouth will talk about that when they present their, what they've
One
done.
more question?
Yeah, red hair.
So, I know you mentioned how you've been looking into other alternatives like the rib mussels or the seaweed. For the seaweed in particular, I'm guessing you've looked into at least a little bit of, there's a lot of new health fads and a lot of push within health communities for different types of seaweed, but those tend to be a little bit unstable and tend to come and go quickly. But have you looked at all into feed for some sort of meat, like livestock or something of the sort?
I have not, but others have. I think, you know, purely on a biomass removal situation, I think it's a lot simpler than shellfish. If you can just plant it and then come back 6 months later and haul it out and then even compost it at that point, and it becomes a nitrogen removal strategy. So yeah, and then the same problems with a town marketing something. So that is a situation. If commercial growers were doing it, yeah, there's a lot of market things to look at. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.